Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and to send me a message on WhatsApp, +60 16 425 6301. Hello, and welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles, a podcast that takes serious history and makes it a little more fun. My name is Keith Hockton. I'm a public historian, author, and broadcaster, and I love most, if not all, things historical. This podcast is about the birth of Scotland and how it came to be, and also how Scotland changed the world as we know it today. And I'll start with the first ever written account by Tacitus, a Roman orator and public official who was probably the greatest historian and one of the greatest prose stylists of his day. In 84 AD, Gaius Julius Agricola, the Roman governor of Britain, set out to subdue the recalcitrant Caledonian tribes of the north. Agricola's army marched into the highlands of what is now Scotland and encountered a confederation of northern clans. They had never gathered in these numbers before, and they were a terrifying sight to behold. He had sent his fleet ahead to plunder at various points along the coast and spread uncertainty and terror. And with his legionnaires marching light, which he had reinforced with the bravest of the Britons and those whose loyalty had been proved during a long peace, he reached the Gorpian Mountains, which he found occupied by the enemy. The Britons were in fact undaunted by the loss of the previous battle and welcomed the choice between revenge and enslavement. They had realized at last that common action was needed to meet the common danger, and had sent round embassies and drawn up treaties to rally the full force of their states. It's in this account by Agricola's son-in-law Tacitus that the peoples of the north of Roman Britannia first enter history. But how far back can the history of Scotland be traced? Who were the Picts and the Gaels? And how did the Viking invasion unite them? Well, if we mean history in the strict sense with written documents and so on, I guess the earliest is probably the Roman conquest, though there was a Greek explorer called Picts who came to Britain in about 300 BC. Can you imagine? And although his own work doesn't survive, he is quoted by a few Roman period Greek scholars, so we have a few little hints, but nothing really that we can say anything meaningful about. So really, with the Roman invasion of Britain, most of our information starts with Tacitus and his account of Agricola's invasion in 84 AD, so effectively the 1st century AD. And before that, there are some semi-legendary accounts that may or may not refer to Scotland, so we can't be sure, and therefore I won't talk about them. However, I'll tell you a little bit more about Roman Britannia as it was. And it went as high as the Antonine Wall. So where was that in modern terms? Interestingly, the Romans claim to have conquered all of Britain, but evidently they didn't, and the northern frontier seems to have been quite flexible. At various times, the Romans would lead expeditions into northern Scotland, probably a wee bit further north than St. Andrews, and they had built 2 walls to contain those who lived further north. Hadrian's Wall, well, that's famous, and runs across the north of England between Newcastle and Carlisle. And then there was the Antonine Wall that was built about 20 to 30 years later. And that basically runs between the River Forth and the Clyde, so roughly between Edinburgh and Glasgow. It wasn't as big or as well built an operation as Hadrian's Wall, and it was only an earth embankment in most places with a few forts scattered every 100 feet or so along it. And it probably wasn't occupied for very long, if truth be told, though there are various debates about how long and whether it was ever reoccupied after it was abandoned as the Romans were driven south. This wall was a sort of an attempt to make what we think of as southern Scotland more fully integrated into the Roman Empire. And in the middle of the 2nd century, probably from about 130 to about 160 AD. And this is actually a really interesting period for several reasons. First and foremost, it's around this time that the 9th Spanish Legion completely disappears. This was one of Rome's toughest, hardest battalions. They had participated in the invasion of Britain with Emperor Claudius. They had also defeated Craticus. They then defeated Venentuus, who was king of a tribe called the Brigantites. And then they suffered a major defeat against Boudica at Colchester as she sacked Colchester. And all of the foot soldiers in the legion were massacred in that attack, and it was only the cavalry that survived. They were then reinforced with legionnaires from the German provinces, and at some stage, at full strength, they marched on the northern Caledonian tribes. And what's interesting is that they were never, ever mentioned again. There's no records of them in Rome. There's no records of them coming back. For all intents and purposes, they were wiped off the face of the earth. My mum and her family and her relatives and our ancestors are all from Glasgow in that area, and I grew up there as a wee child. And once or twice a year, when I was about 4 and 5, she would take me to a part of the Antonine Wall and tell me this tale, and I remember it to this day. And she told me the tale of how the old tribes took on the Romans and defeated them and stole their eagle. And when you stand on that wall, that embankment, and you look out to the hills and beyond, and I've been back there a few times since, I can imagine the fear and the dread, the trepidation that those legionnaires must have felt before going over it into the unknown, and then never to be seen or heard from again. I mean, what army has the power to do that to one of Rome's best and most feared legions? So, historically, there are rumors that just north of the Antonine Wall, there were people called the Picts or the Picti. But Picts weren't there, and they didn't exist at the time that the Romans built the wall. And they're actually a product of the wall rather than anything else. When the Romans first arrived, they used the term Britons or Britanni, generally to apply to all the different peoples of Britain. And Britain was divided into a series of tribal kingdoms at that stage, roughly the size of a modern county. And the early accounts of what we think of as Scotland, from Tacitus and Agricola, just refer to the people as Britons. And they also make specific reference to some of the tribes, like the Caledonii or the Tectosagi, but they never use the term Pict. That term first appears in the 290s, about 150 years after the Antonine Wall was built. And the usual explanation for this is it's a Latin term. It's not a local ethnic term. And it means painted. And it's probably a product of the written south of the frontier becoming a little bit more Roman-like. At this stage, you need to be able to distinguish between them, the northerners, and a Roman. Using the term Briton now doesn't really tell you what a person is like, because someone from Hertfordshire or Essex was almost indistinguishable from a Roman. He was effectively just a Roman provincial. Whereas people the further north you got were a bit wilder, a bit hairier, and they painted their bodies. So we should probably measure Picti originally as being a kind of an adjective defining painted Britons, as opposed to the other Britons, which they classed as civilized Britons, and then eventually Picti just became painted. So they weren't actually a specific group to start with. It was just a pejorative term for the wild and hairies, as some people in Scottish history have referred to the Highlanders in the later periods. And then with the withdrawal of Rome from Britain, we have the Gaels or the Scotti colonizing western Scotland. And the term Scotti is like Picti. It's one of those terms that appears in late antiquity and also is probably pejorative. Unlike Picti, we don't actually know what it means. It isn't a word in Gaelic. It's not transparent with regards to what it means in Latin either. So it's actually a bit of a mystery. And it seems to be used initially to mean perhaps only the military aspect of Irish activity. So, for example, in St. Patrick's correspondence, which was written probably around the 5th century, he refers to civilian Irish people who have converted to Christianity as Irish. He used the word Hiberniaki, but when he's talking about savage raiders and slave traders, of which there were many, he actually calls them Scotti. So it may be that it was a word a bit like the word Viking, a word that originally had a very specific social category term, but gradually becomes used in a more ethnic way. And it isn't specifically, in the early period, anything to do with Northern Britain. The term Scotti is actually used in the early Middle Ages for all Gaelic speakers. But what we do know is that they arrive in roughly the territory that we now call Argyll in the 5th and 6th centuries. Look, it could have begun earlier, and there is a lot of debate about that, but archaeologists have difficulty pinning that invasion down. They actually just can't put a direct time to it. But we do know that St. Columba came across at that time, and St. Patrick also came across at that time. So it does make sense to think that there were other Irish invaders coming into the land around that particular century. So the term, or the use of the term Scotti for that area at this stage, just means Irish. This is the land of the Irish. So that's where they arrived from, and probably at the same time that Roman Britain started to collapse. So again, we're talking about the 5th century, so probably around 480 or 460. So how did the Picts and the Gaels get on with each other then? Well, there was a variety of activity which included sporadic warfare over a 300-year period. And there's a lot of battles in that period, but there's also a lot of long periods where there are no battles mentioned whatsoever. And the northern Picts, at least those based around the Inverness area, converted to Christianity because of the missions from Argyll, from the Scottish part of Britain. Famously, as I just mentioned, from St. Columba, who settled the island of Iona, but presumably also his followers. And guys, if you haven't been to the island of Iona and to the cathedral that St. Columba built there, please go and visit. It's astoundingly beautiful, especially when you take into account it's almost 1,500 years old. So their church emerged as a branch of the Irish Church, and the bishops from northern Pict land went to Irish church councils and so on, and there are actually records of that taking place. So there was definitely conflict, but there was also peace. Also keep in mind that this is the Dark Ages, and everybody was fighting everyone at this stage. Even the different Irish groups were fighting each other within Dalrata, or Dalriata, which was known as the Kingdom of the Scots in Argyll. You've definitely got faction fighting taking place. But there was no, as far as we can tell, there was no antipathy between the Picts and the Gaels. And of course, then the Vikings invade towards the end of the 8th century, and this was a game changer. But did that have an impact on the Gaelistations of the Pictish part of the region? I'd say it did, and it probably had a lot of influence, but perhaps in three very different ways. So the first one is that they actually conquered and settled a large part of the northern territory that we think of as Pictish. So the north of the mainland, certainly in Sutherland and Caithness, maybe even in Easter Ross, and absolutely in Orkney and Shetland, of course, because now they're famously Viking. The second effect that they had is that there were major attacks on Pictish territory. And although the Vikings didn't conquer it for long periods, certainly south of Ross, they probably really screwed up the economy. There's one period in the 860s where there's a very large Viking army camped there for 3 years. And at this stage, they're probably pillaging and they're probably fighting battles and, of course, slave raiding. So they probably create a massive kind of crisis in the north of Scotland at this stage without necessarily having to stay there. And then the third effect is that another area which they managed to conquer and colonize almost entirely were the islands off the west coast, the Hebrides. And about half of the early Scottish kingdoms, the kingdom of Dalriata, which was actually based in the Inner Hebrides. So it may then well have created a bit of a refugee problem. People coming from the islands or being forced from the islands, and some parts of the coastline of Argyll fleeing into the interior of Scotland to escape the Viking raids. So we may well have Scottish refugees coming into what had been Pictish territory, and that might have created a bit of an issue. I also wondered whether this might be a little bit like the way the Hutu militias from the Rwandan genocide ended up in eastern Congo, and they've completely destabilized that region in recent times. What we might imagine were war bands of Gaelic warriors fleeing the Vikings and setting up territories within what had been Pictish territory in the east of Scotland. How then did the Viking invasion impact on uniting the Picts and the Gaels? The effect that the Vikings had across Britain seems to have been that a lot of the relatively long-term antagonism that you saw between the different peoples seems to have ameliorated at that stage. And by the late 8th century and in the middle of the 9th century, this is when things get really bad. Everybody else, all the other natives of Britain have been Christian for a long time. And whether they're English or Welsh or Pictish or Gaels, they're united under that Christian banner. And because what they're being confronted by is a pagan Viking army. And the paganness seems more significant than of any other difference. So down south, we start to see a lot of collaboration between the English and the Welsh rulers. Welsh kings, for the first time, start appearing at the court of English kings, and we've never seen evidence of this before. So the Vikings actually had a galvanizing effect. And in the north, there seems to be something similar going on as well, in that we're seeing interaction between them, between the Gaels and the Picts. Now, exactly what happens and how the Picts and the Gaels or the Scots become a single kingdom, well, that's actually still very unclear. And you have to keep in mind that there were very few written records at this time. But what's really interesting is that nobody really seems to notice. However, I can't help think that it's certainly connected to the fact that you have both the Picts and the Scots being terribly impacted by the Vikings. And they were perhaps collaborating in what seems like an ad hoc fashion maybe to start with, but it becomes something more long-term, something stronger the longer the Vikings stay. Now, presumably, though, there's the implication of one people and one kingdom, and that you have to have one ruler. Well, true in most cases, but what actually happens is that the Scots disappear from the historical record. And through the 9th century, probably from about 820 onwards, we don't hear of any rulers of the Scottish kingdom whatsoever. And we hear of a series of rulers of the Picts, including someone called Kenneth MacAlpin, who subsequently was a Scottish ruler who actually conquered the Picts. The monarch under whom we see the united races beginning their career as this one Scottish nation was the son of that King Alpin, whose bloody head had been affixed as a trophy to the Pictish arms of the gates of Abernethy. The dishonour put upon the father was wiped out when the son entered the same gates in triumph to fill the throne of the united peoples and effectively stretch his sceptre from west to east across the entire country. And that would stretch from the banks of the Forth to the great ocean stream that rose between the promontory of Cape Wrath and the precipices of the Orkneys. In the contemporary records, he's simply referred to as King of the Picts, as is his brother who succeeds him, and then Kenneth's two sons, who in turn succeed their uncle. And then it's the first of the grandsons of Kenneth, who is the first person who is actually called King of Al-Arba by Irish sources. And so Kenneth's younger son, Arth, is the last person to be called King of the Picts in any of the sources. But he actually dies in 878. And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. So the contemporary sources, if our historical sources stopped there, if Scotland had actually disintegrated at that point, we would think that the Picts were still up and running in 878 and that Kenneth MacAlpin was Pictish. But that's actually not how this story turns out. Interestingly, the Irish sources stop using the term King of the Picts altogether, and they start using this term Al-Arba, which is the Irish word for the island of Britain. It's now come to mean in both Scottish Gaelic and Irish Scottish as Scotland. And in fact, it's actually borrowed into Welsh, where Aralban or Aralban is the Welsh word for Scotland. But that's quite a gradual transition. And I'm thinking that it was a term that was already in use in a more circumscribed sense in Irish when talking about the Scots in Britain. I think also a lot of people are very ethnocentric. And when Irish people said way back then, you know, I've got a cousin in Britain, no one actually had to ask which part of Britain. I mean, why would you have a cousin in England? But you would have a cousin in Pictland or in Wales, wouldn't you? So for them, Britain actually meant the Irish bit of Britain because it's the only bit of Britain where proper people lived and spoke a proper language and did proper things according to Irish sources. And so Scotland becomes Britain in that sense. But the slightly complicating factor is that exactly the same time as this change happens, the English sources start referring to the people in the kingdom that had been the Pictish kingdom as Scotters, which is Old English for Scot. So they obviously saw something that was happening. And they mentioned Picts for the last time in exactly the same occasion as the Irish do in 878, when the Vikings kill the son of Kenneth MacAlpin. And that's the last reference to Picts in Anglo-Saxon sources. And after that, they refer to all the people of the north as Scotters. And the first person to be called King of the Scotters is Constantine, son of Arth. But his father is the last person to be called King of the Picts. So it's a bit of a mystery as to why the English suddenly thought that these people were Scots. I think the simplest solution, and it may not be the correct one, would be to think that the language of the court was Gaelic rather than Pictish. And that's probably the easy answer, but it may not be the right one, but it's the best I've got for the present. So then the question was, did a uniform Scottish identity begin to develop under Constantine II? As far as we can tell, after this period, there are almost no mentions of the Picts at all. The term Scot seems to be used for everybody. There's a little bit of evidence, mostly from place names, that Scottish Gaelic in this period had a lot of Pictish loan words in it, but they seem to get smoothed out over a period of time. They get standardized with the general Irish. And that's actually very common when you think about it in colonial situations. So, for example, if you go to Ireland in the 17th or 18th century and you spoke to Irish peasants in the countryside, they would probably have a lot of Irish isms in their English. But now, of course, because of the state of education, because of the way, the world is, the education that we have, TV and everything else, everybody speaks standard English with just the odd word of Irish. I mean, I'm known to do that myself. Sometimes I'll throw wee into a word, which means tiny in Scotland, just because way back when, that's how I grew up. And now and again, it just surfaces and I use it. But over time, you use it less and you lose it and you use it less. That aside, there does seem to be some confusion. We don't really know what happened to the Picts. We just don't. And the curious thing is that nobody mentions them disappearing until the middle of the 12th century, when an English writer called Henry of Huntingdon is writing the history of the English in recent times. And he actually plagiarizes in his introduction from the Venerable Bede. And Bede has famously listed the fact that there were 4 nations living in or on the island of Britain. He says there's the English, there's the Britons, and by that he means the Welsh, who were the original Britons, the Scots and the Picts. And Henry copies this out and then says, but the Picts have completely disappeared. Even their language is gone. God must have hated them. And that's the first time anyone in written history mentions that the Picts have completely disappeared. But if you look at texts produced in Scotland at about the same period, they seem to regard their kingdom as being a direct continuation of the Pictish kingdom. And this is interesting, right? So a king will give land to a church like St. Andrew's or Dunkeld and refer to the fact that the church was founded by his predecessors and we'll name the people who we now know were Pictish kings. So this seems to give thought and a sense that the Scottish kingdom, was actually a continuation of the Pictish kingdom. And of course, by this time, most of the original Scottish kingdom in Argyll isn't really under control of the Scottish kings anymore anyway. It's the Vikings and the local chieftains that are actually running Argyll, and Argyll actually has to be reconquered in the 13th century. And of course, Scotland only emerged as a land we know it today over the course of many centuries, literally, actually many millennia, with all sorts of fascinating ancestry, as we've mentioned, like the Picts and the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons and the Gaels, and of course the Britons, which are the Welsh, which influenced the fabric of our culture. And for this reason, I think when discussing Scottish kings, it's actually important to acknowledge the historical nuances, in terms of what constituted as Scotland, or even as a king, as, some of the famous Scottish monarchs were actually just tribal chiefs. And traditionally, our kings were actually crowned in a ceremony that involved the legendary Stone of Destiny, at Scone Palace. And on the other podcast that I do, There's Always Tea, which I co-host with Nikki Jordan, we've actually done a podcast on the Stone of Destiny. We talk about it. And if you're interested in learning more about the legendary Stone of Destiny, please go to There's Always Tea and have a look at that podcast. It's also there where I talk about it's on that particular podcast, that particular platform. It's also where I talk about Robert the Bruce, and I talk about William Wallace, two incredibly important figures in Scottish history. And I'll talk further about, Rob Roy McGregor, other inspirational characters that go through Scottish history. But Scone Palace, the Stone of Destiny, was actually taken to England by King Edward I. When he conquered Scotland, and he beat Robert the Bruce. And it's been used for the coronation of English monarchs for 700 years. Isn't that amazing? Before it was actually returned to Scotland in 1996. Listen to the podcast that we've done on the Stone of Destiny, because there's a very nice twist there. And suddenly the returning of the Stone of Destiny isn't quite as important as you think it might be. So the last king, the last British English united king to die in battle, was actually King James IV, and he reigned in Scotland between 1488 to 1513. And he actually claimed the throne at the age of 15. Can you imagine? But he was the last king to actually die fighting a battle. Of course, there were many more kings and queens after that, but there was one king that actually changed everything. And of course, that then started me thinking about the dynasties that got us to where we are today, and how influential Scottish kings actually were. So there were 20 Saxon kings, starting with Egbert, who ruled from 827 to 839, and ended with Harold in 1066. After that, there were 4 Norman kings that started with William I and ended with Stephen in 1154. That then saw the rise of the Plantagenet kings, which started with Henry II and ended with Henry III in 1272. What's really interesting then is that there were 4 non-dynastic type kings that started with Edward I and ended with Richard II in 1399. That then saw the rise of the House of Lancaster, which started with Henry IV and ended with Henry VI in 1461. Then there was the House of York, which started with Edward IV and ended with Richard III in 1485. And this is where it gets really interesting, because this is where we now see the rise of the House of Tudor and the kings and queens, which ended with Elizabeth I in 1603. Just as a footnote, everybody knows that her father was Henry VIII, and he had 6 wives. And when we were taught history at school, we actually remembered them by this little poem. And I don't know whether any of you have heard it, but it goes a little bit like this. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. And that's how we remember Henry VIII's 6 wives. Then, of course, we have the rise of the Stuarts, and there were 5 of them that started with James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England and Scotland. But interestingly, in between their reigns, there was civil war, and we had 2 Lord Protectors. Oliver Cromwell from 1653 to 1658, and when he died, his son Richard took over the role as Lord Protector of England and Scotland. But he really didn't want the job and was very happy to resign in 1659. And this is when we see a period called the Restoration. And it's in 1660 that Charles II, or the Merry Monarch as he was known, was crowned king. He was then followed by James II, who had been James VII of Scotland in 1685. He was then replaced with William III in 1689, and he ruled until 1694. Anne then took his place in 1702, and she died in 1714, which then effectively ended the Stuart line. They were then replaced by the Hanoverians and George I in 1714. And what's amazing about this particular family in this rule is that they ruled all the way through to Queen Victoria. Yep, Queen Victoria was a Hanoverian, and she died in 1901. Her dynasty was then replaced by the Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha dynasties, and Edward VIII was the first of those rulers in 1901. That dynasty was replaced by the House of Windsor in 1910 with George V, though at that stage he was still known as a Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha, and he officially changed his name, or effectively anglicized it, in 1917. You know, the First World War had left a nasty taste in the British public's mouth, and the royal family certainly didn't want to be associated with anything German. So they anglicized their name and changed it to Windsor. And of course, the Windsors rule the United Kingdom and its dominions until this day. The border with Scotland and England was actually finalized in 1237, and it's never changed. And the first of the Scottish kings to rule both England and Scotland, as we mentioned a little while ago, was James I. But of course, that then started me thinking, without the Scottish monarchy, what would the world and Great Britain look like? And when you think about it, the Scottish monarchy actually played a crucial role in the history of the British Isles. I mean, the union of the Scottish and English crowns in 1603, when James I, took over England, actually laid the foundation for the eventual, political union of the two kingdoms for the first time. And that took place in 1707. And this event actually shaped history and the identity of what would become the United Kingdom as we know it today. Without Scottish monarchs, the process of unification might never have taken place. That's something to think about, isn't it? You know, Scottish monarchs and nobility were involved in overseas colonization and empire building, although to a lesser extent compared to their English counterparts. But, you know, the union of crowns actually allowed for the pooling of resources and efforts in establishing colonies, including those in North America. In fact, Montreal, the French in Montreal, wouldn't have been defeated had not a Scottish army have been involved. The relationships between Scotland and other countries, particularly England, France, other European powers, they were often influenced by the actions of Scottish monarchs. And altering this dynamic could have led to different alliances, conflicts, and, of course, geopolitical shifts in Europe. And, of course, the patronage of Scottish monarchs had an impact on the cultural and intellectual development of Scotland and beyond. You know, the Renaissance era, for example, saw the Scottish court as a centre of learning and artistic impression. The absence of Scottish monarchs could have altered that cultural landscape, not only in Scotland, but also in Europe. The Scottish Reformation, which led to the establishment of, Presbyterianism as the dominant form of Protestantism in Scotland, was actually influenced by the policies and decisions of Scottish monarchs. You know, the religious landscape of Scotland and these interactions with England, it would have likely have been very different without their influence. And of course, you had the Jacobite uprisings, which aimed to restore the Stuart dynasty, including Scottish monarchs, to the British throne. And that actually played a large role in reshaping British history in the 17th and 18th centuries. The absence of Scottish monarchs could have certainly changed the dynamics of these uprisings and their outcomes. So, the presence of Scottish monarchs in history, it's had a profound effect and a profound impact on the development of the British Isles and Europe and the wider world. And their actions, their decisions, and their interactions with other powers have actually contributed to the historical trajectory of nations and the courses of global events. And I think if you remove Scottish monarchs from this history, it would result in a significantly different world. Folks, thank you so much for listening to this podcast and staying with me. I find, the whole history of Scotland and its relationship to the world very interesting. And I thought it would just be an interesting one to put together, so people actually had a bit of an idea where the Scots actually came from. And obviously the answer to that is initially from Ireland. But like England, they were affected by the invasion of the Vikings, who stayed there for a very long time. And of course, then the Anglo-Saxons, then the Normans. All of this influenced their history. Guys, if you like this and you like listening to it on your platform, please like it. Give it a 5-star rating, please, because that will help push it up the charts. I have to laugh because I'm not on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or any of the other platforms kind of pushing these podcasts, because all I'm trying to do at the moment is populate the site with interesting content. And at some stage, I'm sure I'll get round to doing something like that. Or maybe I won't. I don't know. But I'm encouraged by the amount of people that are actually listening to the podcast without really any kind of advertising whatsoever. So thank you very much, guys. Please share it as much as you can. And I'll continue to research and give you content that interests me and hopefully interests you. Thanks again, everyone. Bye for now.